soon, so has everybody got their headsets? I know, but they haven't got the headsets on. Yes. Can everybody hear me? Is everybody's headset working? Yes. Great. So if everybody's headset is working, we will begin the session. And just to note that this session is being live streamed out through ODI channels and other partner channels as well. Welcome everybody to this event this morning. My name is Dr. Rebecca Naden, and I'm the Director of the Global Risks and Resilience Programme at ODI Global, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today to the Climate, Peace and Transboundary Resilience Pavilion. Today's event is on enhancing climate finance for recovery, resilience and adaptation in fragile and conflict-affected contexts in the Middle East and North Africa region. It's co-hosted today by ODI Global, UNDP and FCDO, so we're delighted all to welcome you here on behalf of all of the partners. I'm really excited about today's event because today's event is really about shining a spotlight on the work done to scale up climate finance in one of the most climate vulnerable yet unserved parts of the world. Fragile and conflict-affected countries are some of the most vulnerable to climate-related challenges, which is why we've chosen to have a pavilion this year to really bring attention to this issue. Yet many of these countries face significant barriers in accessing climate finance need to build resilience. In fact, between 2014 and 2021, extremely fragile states received only $2 per capita in climate finance compared to $162 in more stable settings. So that really is a really significant gap. The problem is particularly acute in the Middle East and North Africa region. IPCC have identified Middle East and Northern Africa as a climate risk hotspot. Yet conflict-affected countries like Syria and Yemen have consistently received far less adaptation finance than other fragile states. In fact, 16 and 4 times less finance respectively between 2010 and 2021. So that really is an appalling statistic. Of course, scaling up finance is only part of the issue. We must also build countries' readiness to receive and use this finance and support more joined-up, risk-informed action amongst all actors working in fragile areas. And this includes governments, local communities, as well as people working across the different sectors of humanitarian aid, development, peace building, disaster risk management, climate change mitigation and adaptation. So these sectors really need to start working and talking together more effectively. So I'm really gratified to see attention being paid to this issue. And yesterday I had the pleasure of moderating a high-level round table which saw the launch of a network of climate vulnerable countries affected by conflict and crisis, and where the Yemeni Minister for Water and Environment, Tawfiq al-Shajabi, introduced and really articulated the strong support for this network. So we were really happy to see such strong support from countries who attended the roundtable and who are going to take part in this network. And today, this event, as I mentioned, we're hosting it in the Climate, Peace and Transboundary Resilience Pavilion. And this is the first pavilion of its kind dedicated at a COP to this type of this agenda. So today's event, we're going to hear from expert speakers about some of the potential pathways to accelerate and expand climate finance and action. So the event's going to be structured in 2 parts. First of all, we're going to hear a keynote speech from a leading representative of a country at the forefront of these critical discussions. And then we'll hear special remarks from our co-organiser, UNDP. And then we'll have the opportunity to have a panel discussion inviting a wide range of expert voices to discuss pathways for scaling up climate finance across the MENA region. So without further ado, I would like to invite Assistant Secretary General to the UN and Director of the Regional Bureau of Arab States at UNDP to provide the first keynote speech. So I would like to invite Mr. Abdallah Al-Dari to come to the stage.
Good morning, Sabah al-Khair. I should be speaking Arabic since I have 30% of the world's conflicts in the Arab region, but I'm not going to. Let me go back. I'd like to say that we have been addressing conflicts in the MENA region by trying to address the consequences rather than the roots of those conflicts. And most of the roots of the conflicts in the region are in climate. Sudan, we know that in Sudan, the question was management of land, management of water resources, and conflicts over scarce land and water. And instead of trying to address the root cause of that, we opted, as international community, we opted to put some topical ointments on a very challenging situation. Even now, after all what we have seen, we see countries in the international community rushing to provide food aid to Sudan, a country that is the food basket for the Arab region and Africa. And therefore, one has to ask oneself whether this can continue forever and whether the pledges in the Paris conference, for example, recently on Sudan of $2 billion, first of all, would be fulfilled. Secondly, are sustainable. And thirdly, what's the medium-term impact of feeding Sudan with humanitarian aid rather than trying to revamp Sudanese agriculture by better management of land and water and the whole agroeconomy of the country. There are still large parts of Sudan where there's no fighting and agriculture can still happen. But because of our insistence as international community on addressing matters as a humanitarian situation only, not through the HDP nexus, we find ourselves today where farmers in Sudan stopped sowing their seeds because they said there's no hope for next year, there are no marketing, no finance, no distribution, and so on and so forth. So next year's food insecurity gap in Sudan will be much worse than this year's. Same applies to Somalia, where the international community generously provided billions and billions of dollars to provide humanitarian aid to Somalia. And I need to be very clear, we need humanitarian assistance. But imagine if since the 1984 drought in Somalia, we've been working on addressing climate issues, on how do we better manage land, how do we better manage agriculture, how do we better manage people's movements and ensure sustainable development in the country. And the example the doctor gave us here now of the $2 compared to the $161 is just a stark manifestation of how we, and it might sound very strong, but how we failed those countries. Take Syria. The EU alone provided very generously 33 billion euros of humanitarian aid to Syria since 2012. It's European taxpayers' money, and we should be grateful for that money, and we are. But $33 billion could have completely changed the ability of the country to deal with droughts. By the way, the country is now in the 7th year of drought. So one day, should refugees think of going back to Syria, the land that they left is no longer there. The agricultural activity and the agricultural economy they left behind is not going to be there. And therefore, the incentive for them to return is disappearing day after day. 33 billion euros. And we are talking about $2 per person for climate finance. There's something that is not gelling well. And even though we've been talking about the humanitarian development peace nexus for years now, I think it's time that we practice this thing seriously. Same applies to Yemen. UNDP is very active in Yemen, but we are under increasing pressures to abandon development work and focus only on humanitarian work for political reasons. And I wonder what is the wisdom of trying to abandon development, especially in the rural community development, in agriculture, in replacing cod with coffee, as we are doing now, with creating fisheries value chain where women are the leading entrepreneurs, and that is the future of the country with young Yemenis, and abandon all of that in order to say, well, the political situation is very bad, we don't agree with this party or that party, let's send food. And 50% drop in food aid anyway, we saw it last year, so that no development and not even food supplies. So where are we leaving the Yemenis? And we are the people of the leave no one behind. So this is an excellent idea to have this panel. Is finally we need to adopt a new way. I'm very happy that UNDP Syria is negotiating with the Green Climate Fund one preparedness grant. It's a $1 million, but it could open the way for much bigger activities in this field. We hope that politics don't step in again and prevent the country from trying to deal with this drought that is harming all the agricultural patterns that have been established in the past 5,000 years of agriculture in that part of the world. So this is a call. We will support the network that you spoke about. We as UNDP, this is our cause, how to maintain and promote development, especially climate activities and funding in conflict situations. So thank you very much. I wish this panel best of success. And again, I reiterate UNDP's commitment to working with you towards bringing the funding to where people deserve it and where we can guarantee future and sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary General Al-Dahari. I think you make some really important points, and I think we are not grasping fully some of the trade-offs of some of the interventions. We see this quite strongly. We're focused on one problem rather than focusing on a multi-hazard context, for want of a better word. So we're focused solely on, as the Secretary General says, on delivering this humanitarian assistance, but without understanding fully the trade-offs that creates. And you're so right, you know, we've talked a long time about the humanitarian development peace nexus. So we're hoping actually that by bringing the groups together and this network that was launched yesterday, we can finally get some power behind that. It's country-led, it's country-driven, and to really make people sit up and listen, but also take some action. So I would really like now to invite His Excellency Abdullah Hakim Alaya, who's the Deputy Minister of Environment for the Republic of Yemen, to provide some remarks on what he's just heard. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Excellency, colleagues, and friends. I am honored to speak at this important event focused on enhancing climate finance for recovery and resilience in fragile regions like Yemen and the MENA region. Millions of people in our area in these areas face overlapping challenge of conflict and climate vulnerability requiring urgent and coordinated action. In Yemen, climate change worsens exit struggles such as water scarcity, food insecurity, and ecosystem degradation, including also degradation of biodiversity and wildlife, particularly in the rural area. This pressure often escalates local conflict, making the situation even more direct. Despite this challenge, Yemen has identified priority through its climate action plan, but without sufficient financial support, our risk began unfulfilled. As we gathering here today, I would like to underscore 2 points, two key points. The needs of fair climate finance. Fragile states like Yemen receive far less per capita climate funding compared to the suitable nations. This limits our ability to address urgent needs like droughts, desertification, and extreme heat, which make tension and strain communities' resilience to challenge. Climate action as path of peace, addressing environment stress can reduce resources conflict and promote stability. Investment in sustainable agriculture, resources and resilience infrastructure empower communities, foster long-term species, and prepare for future challenges. In conclusion, I call on all partners, governments, organizations, and financial donors work together to prioritize climate finance for fragile countries. Yemen is committed to build resilience future, and with fair support, we can make this vision a reality. Not just for Yemen, but a model for resilience across the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I'd just like to say that both the Minister and Deputy Minister have given a huge amount of their time and support to this initiative to really draw attention to the importance of establishing a network. And as the Deputy Minister so rightly says, it's now time to put words into action. So on that, I'd now like to move to the second part of the event, and I would like to invite our speakers, panelists, to come to the stage. So the second part of this panel discussion will be to hear from a range of different perspectives, to reflect on the remarks that we've heard, to reflect on what's been going on in terms of this agenda throughout this COP, and to offer perhaps some of their suggestions on how to address some of these barriers to climate finance in the region. So if I could invite the panelists to the stage, please. So our first speaker for the panel will be Dr. Musaid Al-Khan. If you pass the mic. Sorry, there's a bit of a wire. Sorry. So Dr. Aklan is a senior researcher for water, environment and climate change at the SANA Center for Strategic Studies in the Yemen, and has worked extensively on rethinking the Yemen economy initiative. Dr. Aklan has over 15 years' experience with local organizations, INGOs, on issues of water resource management and climate change. So Dr. Aklan, we've heard about the human security implications of exacerbating climate impacts in Yemen. And we know that Yemen receives some of the lowest adaptation finance per capita despite its high climate vulnerability. But from your perspective, what are the core barriers preventing Yemen from accessing this much needed climate finance? And how are these challenges impacting communities and institutions on the ground?
Thank you so much. And thank you for this invitation to address our climate finance problems. And in fact, all what we have are challenges in Yemen. And I can say we have no climate finance, and we are one of the lowest countries in the world. If I'm not mistaken, maybe number 3 or 4 among the lowest countries in Yemen in terms of climate finance. And in terms why we are not getting this access to climate finance, even the country is one of the most affected countries by climate change. And just to mention some, just the last rainfall season and floods, there are more than 500,000 people are affected by this flood, and more than 100 people died. Around 30% of agricultural lands were destroyed and impacted by huge floods. And you can imagine how this impacted the countries where they rely to a large extent on agricultural activities, especially in rural areas where 70% of people are living. So we have many challenges, and we discussed this for the last 2 days. And we are pushing, we are trying our too much with the climate finance, and they understand the process, they understand the difficulties, but there are procedures which they need to be reviewed and to consider these difficulties and challenges. And the biggest challenge, as you know, is the conflict. I mean, during the ongoing conflict, it's not easy not only to implement any adaptation or mitigation measures, but it is not easy to follow or to prepare the required proposals for climate finance from different finance agencies working in the climate issues. And the second one is the limited institutional capacities in Yemen during the conflict, and it's not easy for the institutions to follow such difficult procedures. And adding to that, the human capacity is also degraded. They are getting less and less, not only because of the economic situation, but many of them left the public institutions and start to work with the international institutions. And this is mainly because of the economic situation and the income aspect. Adding to that, the absence of the direct access identities in Yemen. So far, we have no single one who has the right to get this climate access, whether the private or public identities. And it's also difficult for them to get this level. One of, I would say, the biggest private sector in Yemen, they follow the process. And at the last stage, they stopped, mainly because they have been asked to have their independent section for this climate issues, which means to change the whole system of the company, which was difficult for them, and they stepped back. And now we have some local banks who are following the procedure, but it's still difficult. And as I understand from our colleague here, it's important to have public or private entities who are credited for this climate finance, which is also one of the other difficulties we are facing. And this is coupled with the limited resources and the fragile economy for the last 10 years. On the other hand, as I said, the requirements, whether for the proposals themselves or for the having the this local entities getting the right to this climate finance. Also, the evidence shows that climate finance in fragile states is not attractive for the climate finance and donors to work in Yemen, because there is a high risk. And there is now a call to reduce this risk and to look back to the procedures and how to work in a more, in a more safe area, whether to put this risk or a part of it on the national authority, national government, or to ask the climate finance donors to support in this regard in terms of the risks. And in terms of how this challenges impacted communities and the people and local peoples, I mean, without climate finance and with the increase of the climate impacts year after year, we have less resilience, we have less adaptation process, and we have less abilities through the local people who are fighting to cover their needs and income even before this current conflict, before this increase of climate impacts. So this is getting difficult, and this also impacted the lives and livelihoods of people and led to the more displacement. Nowadays we have 4.5 million internal displaced people, and there are around 10% of these people are displaced because of the climate change. And many of them have been forced to displaced more than one time because of the climate impacts, because of the floods, because the areas where the people can easily settle is the public areas, which are normally close to the valleys, to the floods areas. So I think this is what I have, and I would be happy to answer any further questions if you have. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I think you raised a couple of really important points there. One, of course, being this issue of capacity, where actually we're seeing a sort of internal national level brain drain, so to speak, where, as you rightly point out, some of the very most experienced public sector staff who understand and know this area then being pulled out of those institutions to work for the international community institutions. So actually there's perhaps maybe much more of a capacity building role that could be done there. And then also I think another really important point, this issue of risk tolerance of the climate funds. This is a topic that comes up a lot. I think unless we address that question, it's always going to be the elephant in the room. Yes, these countries are high risk across a whole range of risk dynamics, from security to political, but we need to, I think, have better criteria for this financing to be able to go into these countries with the acceptance of, yes, it is a high risk environment. Thank you so much. So I'm now delighted to invite the second speaker, who is Dr. Amgad Al-Mahdi, who's the Regional Manager for the Middle East and North Africa at the Green Climate Fund, so well placed to answer some of these questions. Dr. Al-Mahdi brings over 25 years of hydrology expertise in operations research and academic roles. And at the GCF, he's led the organisation's water investment strategy and also Director of Research for the Development for MENA in the International Water Management Institute and Head of Water Resources of the Australia Bureau of Meteorology. So, Dr. Al-Mahdi, the previous speaker laid out for us some of these challenges of institutions and organisations in Yemen in terms of accessing this support, which, as we know, is shared by all the kind of climate vulnerable countries affected by conflict and fragility. So how is the GCF specifically working to overcome some of these barriers to climate finance access in these countries? And in your kind of opinion and perspective, what additional measures does the GCF think are needed to ensure effective delivery and scaling up of climate finance in the region?
Thanks, Rebecca, and good morning, everyone. So I think, like, before I try to answer this question, I just wanted to reflect on how the MENA region represented within the Green Climate Fund to the scale of the finance. So if we look at the MENA region at the Green Climate Fund, we actually see the MENA region, it's very under-programming. And that, of course, for several challenges, I think it's very much aligned with what my colleague has said in terms of institutional capacity, from policy to technical and to opportunity to access climate finance, to even understand what climate finance means, what is the role of the climate finance. So if we look at the whole portfolio in GCF, since GCF has been started in 2015, and we have allocated very much 16 billion by last month, and those 16 billion leverage 61 billion in total. The MENA region only received 6% out of all of that. and that is quite alarming for us, because if we look at in terms of the climate change, I think in the MENA region, everyone will agree with me here, it has immense of a challenge for the climate change, from drought to flood to increasing temperature, heat waves, sea level rise, everything. So how we try through Green Climate Fund to overcome those challenge and also focus on the countries that already in resilient, in fragile and conflict state, and also vulnerable communities as well. So in October last year, we have released our new strategy that, because we work on a 4-year cycle, and our new strategy that covered from 24 to 27 was coming very clear for us, with a very clear mandate to really focus on the countries that are vulnerable, fragile, and conflict, but also come with a very clear target for us, and that in terms of in response to those challenges that we have here, from institutional capacity, from how we build the level of awareness about climate finance, how we educate countries about climate finance, but also how to improve access to climate finance as well. So the way we try to do this and overcome that, so we have different modality that allow us to make this happen. So one of those modality is the readiness modality, as we call it, and that comes with a clear envelope for each country, like 10 million for each country, and that come as two stream, one for national adaptation plan, which is 6 million, come in two tranche, 3 and 3. The first 3 is to formalize your national adaptation plan for the countries, and we work with Yemen to do this, and they are really advanced in that. And then the second 3 million is actually to try to implement the national adaptation plan. The other 4 millions, it's actually come to really tackling 3 objectives here: to build the capacity within the country, to also help the country to programming, so they can identify their priorities, their needs, but also scope those interventions or solutions that they are really looking to access climate finance for. And that's where really, like 2 days ago, with the deputy minister and also the deputy president and the 2 ministers for water and agriculture, we have released the country program for Yemen that really identify a very clear priorities for Yemen, and also make us really think again from GCF perspective how we can really support Yemen on those priorities. So there is 18 priorities being identified, and we really committed to invest on those ideas and bring those to be like a funded project. So that's how the readiness modality can really overcome some of the challenge in terms of institutional capacity, programming, identifying priorities, working on integrated policy and plan. But also when we come to the project design, there is a lot of a challenge as well, because when you look at the political and instability, and also how to reach the community, how to really think about adaptive management approach when you design your project. Because again, operating in those countries come with an extra cost. And we have faced some of the challenge where an entity approaching us with the country, putting a proposal that's been approved, when it comes into implementation, they found actually the whole financial structure is not valid. Because to go to some places, you really need, there are extra measures that you really need to take, and that's, of course, it changes the whole financial structure of your program. So again, in the project design, we become very active as GCF to engage with the entities that actually able to work on those countries, which is like international entities like IMI, UN organizations, but also other organizations as well. But what we also try to do and encourage them is actually to engage with the non-government institutions and communities group within those countries, because we believe if we are able to use the project to build that capacity within the country, this is how the country really can become more resilient, standing on their feet. So in the project design, we become really very involved from the beginning to ensure like all those adaptive measures are included into the design. National organizations are well represented in the design as well. Also, the non-government institutions are also part of that project implementations and community as well. But also we try to assess those projects by focus again on the sustainability and resilience of those projects. So we try to ensure really like all operational and maintenance aspect for whatever interventions they've been doing, it's actually, again, well represented, well structured on those projects as well. And for Yemen, for example, we did agree the first project will be on early warning system, and that again it's a quick fix from our side because it's for us it's really one of the simple project. It has a very clear structure. It's about infrastructure to build that early warning system that can really again inform investment and reduce disaster. But also one key aspect in terms of what is the role really of the climate finance? Because there is humanitarian funds, there is a development fund, there is peace building fund. And the way we see really the climate finance, it's a complementarity for all those funds. It shouldn't be compete and it shouldn't replace them, but it actually should complement all those funds. And where the entry point for the climate finance as well. So if there is a development fund doing something in a country, especially in the countries in fragile states or conflict states, the rule for the climate funds is to take that development for the scale. And that's the way we should really think about and encourage the country really to think in a strategically way. If you are engaged with other donors, other development funds, or any other philanthropy as well, think about what is the next stage and bring us as well at that early stage of the discussion, because we can put a national program where climate finance become at an entry point where all the development being designed, pilot, tested, and ready for a scale, and that will be really the rule for the climate finance. So the rule for the climate finance is really to scale, to de-risk investment, to attract private sector, and take all the first loss in the capital as well. So that again the rule for the climate finance. So if a private sector reluctant to invest in those countries because the risk is quite high, we are happy to come and take all that risk, take all the upfront costs in terms of design, assessment, design your financial model, provide that early capital for construction and so on, and take all that upfront costs to really attract the private sector. Because again, I wanted to finish with, we cannot continue rely on public finance. Public finance is declining everywhere. If we look around us about the international economy, the inflation rate, interest rate around the globe, the public finance, all government doing actually cut on their expenses, cut on their aid programs, cut on their development programs. So public finance will be actually declining based on the international economy. So where most of the money exists, it's actually the money exists in the private sector. And that's the rule really for the climate finance, to come and de-risk that private sector and encourage them to invest and do that public-private partnership as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Al-Mahdi. I think you raised a couple of very important points there. I think this issue of priority identification is absolutely key. So we talk a lot about, country-led, country-driven, but actually what does that really mean? That's actually sitting down with the country, understanding from their perspective what are their priorities. And then I think what's absolutely key that you mentioned is all of this needs to be implementable. Otherwise, again, it's just words on paper. And actually, we had an event here with Somalia, and they were talking about their NDC, and they were saying, the NDC, Somalia's NDC 3.0, it's got to be implementable and it's got to be investable. That's the key as well. And I think, it's really important as well to, what is the role of climate finance? Again, we hear the term climate finance all the time, but I actually have a feeling it means lots of different things to lots of different people. And actually, I think we, maybe it's time to sort of have a sort of a more clearer understanding when we're discussing climate finance, what we're actually talking about. And I think, as you say, from the GCF's point of view, it's about scalability, it's about de-risking investments, it's about underwriting that risk. But you are right. I think we really need to stop thinking about public financing as being the answer here, because, as you say, the realities of the global economic and national economies are changing radically. So now I'd like to invite our third panelist to say a few words. So I'm very happy to invite Mr. Dauda Undaye, who's the lead climate change specialist at the Islamic Development Bank. So the Islamic Development Bank is the lead MDB focused on the region. And Mr. Undaye coordinates Islamic Development Bank's activities related to climate change and nature-based solutions to ensure proper design and effective implementation of climate change adaptation and resilience throughout ISDB's activities. I would like to ask, what is Islamic Development Bank doing to sort of support fragile and conflict-affected states in the region to access climate finance and enhance climate action? Because I think you have quite a body of work in this, so it would be great for our audiences, both here and listening online, to hear your reflections.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. Throughout this week, I have participated in a few panels, and what I hear is around the same about people living in conflict-affected areas and fragile environment. At the same time, they want to live their normal lives, and they want to have access to food, water, energy. And it's always difficult from the outside to say, okay, we need to send humanitarian, but they want to go their normal life and have projects being financed, and also see that they can have hope in the implementation of their business activities and day-to-day lives. So that's what, as institutions as well, we need to do. We need to make sure that the finance is distributed in a way that at least there will be, if there's no positive discrimination for these countries, at least that there won't be any discrimination. So what we have done at the Islamic Development Bank, we've been working with countries in our region, but also in other regions, and trying to tailor the financing depending on the needs. So you would see, for example, when we deal with Yemen, when we deal with other countries like Palestine, etc., we know that we want to provide concessional financing, we want to provide grant financing. There is a Al-Aqsa fund that is hosted by the Islamic Development Bank and provide grant resources to Palestine. It has been doing it for years. And these activities are for water security, food security, access to energy, and it's very easy to link those activities with climate, because the climate risks that you would see in these areas are typical and are exacerbated. And what we have done is to really internalize climate risk management, so that all the operations of the bank, they have to go through that screening to make sure that what we are financing is resilient to climate change. A few other examples, when we talk about microfinance and also mesofinance for micro, medium, and small enterprises, we have a mechanism of economic empowerment. That means that we found out that providing the finance is not enough. You need to do more. You need to provide not only the finance, but ensure that there is access to market, ensure that the small institution that you are supporting, that they have the capacity. So there's a whole package that this economic empowerment program that has that was initiated with examples in Tunisia, and then it started being spread across the region to ensure that communities, they have not only access to finance, but they also have access to all the capacity building needed. We just launched 2 days ago with our colleagues from the Green Climate Fund a readiness program that is covering countries like Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and Oman, looking at increasing access to climate finance, including for the private sector. We are going to build the capacities of private sector institutions, and we are going to support the entities from the private sector to become direct access entities, so that we could have more climate finance in the region. We know that it's not easy. I would like to give maybe also a couple of examples. In Lebanon, a few years ago, we started working with UNDP and with the World Bank in supporting the development of a green investment facility. And this also started with looking at the market, looking at the environment. It was not easy for the banking sector in Lebanon had issues. The private sector was also a resilient one, but still we needed to find a solution. So we started with a few studies, and with this GCF readiness as well, we are going to go further to make sure that this facility is operational. We also supported Palestine in terms of their NDC implementation, looking at gender inclusion in all the NDCs for the water sector, energy sector, food security, etc. So I would say that we really find a way to support through different angles: policy support, finance, knowing that we have to focus on concessional finance and grant financing, but at the same time supporting the public and private sector so that the communities can have access to these resources and to more climate finance. So I will stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think you raised some important points there, actually, sort of digging a bit deeper down into what we mean by capacity building. And I think it's interesting, the points you raise about making sure that the climate risk is mainstreamed throughout all of what the bank does. So there's that internal capacity building. And then also I thought it was very interesting about this sort of economic empowerment program, because one assumes finance is a complex topic. There's some complex terms there. It's not something that is always easy to understand in terms of what's needed. And again, going back to this question of how different financial institutions, what is their risk management framework, and then what is the capacity then of countries to absorb that in terms of their banking sector, in terms of the private sector to utilize the money. And also interesting as well that GCF and ISDB are working together around that readiness program. So last but not least, I'd now like to turn to our fourth panelist, Dr. Sandra Ruckstuhl, who is Special Advisor to the Director General and Senior Researcher at the International Water Management Institute. She has more than 2 decades of experience working on issues of water and natural resource in management and conflict for the World Bank, the US government, and the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Dr. Ruckstuhl has worked in more than 25 countries in the Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central and South Asians, and the Balkans. Dr. Ruckstuhl, the MENA region accounts for over 100 million displaced people who are highly vulnerable to climate change. Because we've heard their livelihoods are being undermined by climate change and conflict. So from your perspective and your kind of long experience, what options do you think exist for potentially scaling up to address immediate climate shocks while also laying the groundwork for long-term resilience for these communities?
Thank you. I'm going to take these headphones off. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. So this is a good question, and I'm both dismayed and glad to see that this has really showed up. This part of the conversation has showed up in a lot of these events over the course of this week. We have a very special and important partnership with FCDO at the moment to develop investable, scalable models for climate resilience in refugee hosting communities. This is a project that was announced the other day in the UK Pavilion, the JAHAZ project. So we're talking about the big picture about how financing works. But where do we start, right? We need models for investment. We need evidence to prove that these are good examples, that they will have impact, that needs are being met, and that all the requirements of the financing of the financial institutions are being met. So that's what we have to do under the JAHAZ project, right? So this is part of the King Abdullah II's Climate Refugee Nexus Initiative, the King of Jordan, that he announced at COP27, which yielded this project and this partnership with FCDO. We're kicking off right now in Jordan, and with the hope that this will go beyond. But we will be working in 3 communities, which we're going through the process of selection and consultations right now with the government, to design in-hosting scenarios to understand what the vulnerabilities are, to understand how resilience building should look, and to design these models for investment that hopefully will bring together some of the institutions sitting here in a few years' time once we have the evidence that's required. The partnership with the government is extremely important. As we know, investing in these types of situations is very complicated. We've talked a lot about risk and the different dimensions of risk, but there are politics at play too, right? How do we invest in these types of situations when these types of communities aren't always fully accounted for in national strategies, and the vulnerabilities aren't fully understood because of the temporary nature, we would hope, the temporary nature of these types of communities, but they're not always temporary, right? As we well know. So in Jordan, for example, there's a matter of we've got disaster risk reduction strategies, we've got climate change policies and investment plans and so forth. But how do those account for the hosting scenarios? You've got a country that's experiencing extreme climate stress, as the entire region is, and that's compounded with the demographic pressures. And I'm talking about refugees, but it could be IDPs. It could be movements of populations for any number of reasons. But when a certain location moves or is suddenly experiencing the movement of people, the hosting of people, systems are under stress, services are under stress, resources are under stress. So we need to examine all of that. And that's what we're doing in this case of Jordan at the moment. I want to say that the DRR approach is important to this model. It's not, DRR isn't always as well accounted for as an intervention model in national climate strategies, but it gives us a lens of the importance of near-term response and also long-term adaptation. And the reason why that's important in these types of communities is because it also helps us bring together humanitarian and development action, okay? Which again, in these types of circumstances, in a conflict-affected location or a location that's hosting refugees, or IDPs, that these two communities, humanitarian and development, do need to find better ways to work together. They have different knowledge, different data, different mandates, but by working together, we can mitigate risk down the line much, much better, and it's far more efficient. So that's part of what we're doing under the Jahaz project, is working with the humanitarian community in Jordan, because, again, we're in a situation of transition. For example, if we're focusing on communities that are hosting Syrian refugees, the war started, 12 years ago? If I'm counting correctly, correct me if I'm wrong at the moment. But so many years later, and investment still needs to happen. Recovery for and support for these communities, it's changing. The government has to take on new responsibilities. They're going through policy reform because they're realizing that refugees may not be leaving, or the nature of this hosting situation has to change. UNHCR, their money is going. WFP, their money is going. So therefore, we need to find investable solutions that will help build resilience in refugee hosting communities for the long term. And I'm speaking about refugees, but the whole point is those who are not counted, those who live in the hosting communities, those who are, had so much water for such a price, or so many jobs, or what have you, before the refugees came in, and now they're experiencing, their livelihoods, their households have changed massively as well. So this understanding of this environment for investment needs to take all of that into account to lift up all parts of these communities. So it requires really coordinated action with a variety of agencies, like I said, with different types of mandates. Consultation needs to include these different parts of the communities as well, so that interventions can be appropriately designed. And that's what we'll be doing, working with the local authorities. That requires a lot of relationship building so that we can have the reach that we need to have. And again, back to the DRR example, so what we're doing in the Jahaz project, we've got, under this sort of DRR lens, we're working with the UK Met Office to develop impact-based forecasting systems for these types of communities. So IBF, again, very particular. I mean, it's based on vulnerability. How do you need to inform someone of what's going to happen when a weather event occurs so they know how to respond? That's also based on a full understanding of vulnerability. So we're working together on these IBF systems. That helps bring down the DRR strategies that are still at a very high level in Jordan, helps to localize them and operationalize them. But all of this data of understanding how these communities work, what their vulnerabilities are, what local action needs to look like for people to protect and prevent, also can inform longer-term investments where there seems to be a real focus on nature-based solutions. So we'll be, in this project, working with these communities, with the authorities, FCDO and so forth, to design nature-based interventions, nature-based solutions to deal with the flooding problems, the drought problems, the air quality problems, the heat problems, all of this. So very, again, locally tailored solutions to understand what does this type of intervention look like in a refugee camp, in a city center that has a large number of refugees, in a border community that's also hosting. We've chosen different types of hosting communities so that we can have a better understanding of what the different models for investment might need to be. So our hope is, through this project, that this will be the beginning of a portfolio. And there's so much learning that could be done. It's not just a matter of this Jahaz project and the three communities we'll be working in, but this hopefully will be a trend towards the kind of investment that FCDO seems to be leaning towards, which is very exciting to us, to help really, like I said, develop these investable models so that we can support the financial institutions to do all the targeted investment that they intend to. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to pull out a couple of points that you raised there. I think absolutely, as you pointed out, that these communities are not always accounted for in national country planning. And then also I think this point about DRR. So actually, it always strikes me at the COPs, you know, where is the Convention on Biodiversity? Where's the Convention on UNCCD on combating desertification? You know, Sendai. You know, we have all of these international. You know, some of them these are legally binding treaties. Some of them are frameworks. In the case of Sendai, but actually, for example, if we have as much focus, you know, quite rightly that we do on UNFCCC as we did on the CBD, actually we'd be addressing many of these issues that are impacting communities. Sendai has a very clear framework for understanding multi-hazard contexts. You know, that's what it talks about. Adaptation, climate adaptation, that's where we're talking about addressing climate change over in a decadal sense. So there we need to be looking at the modelling and understanding how we're adapting in the long term. But Sendai and DRR as well, in order anticipatory action, impact-based forecasting system, all of these frameworks are there, but we are very siloed. We are very, very siloed. Okay, I would like to open up the floor now for some questions. If anybody has any questions for our panelists.
Hello, thank you very much. This is Elizabeth Selwood from the UN Environment Programme. Really, really interesting discussion. Lots of questions, but maybe I start with one about fragmentation of adaptation, and there's quite a lot of it. This is I think a particular problem for this region, but not only for this region, that a lot of the interventions on livelihoods and water resources are fragmented, partly due to limited government capacity, in some cases, you know, limited territorial control over some areas. And what we are seeing in some contexts is that water resources particularly are being depleted, and soil depleted, biodiversity depleted, because of interventions that are primarily short-term and sometimes humanitarian in nature, but are not based on an understanding of some of the longer-term risks to ecosystems. So very happy to hear about this new readiness proposal for some of the affected countries. But I guess my question is how to ensure that science and longer-term understanding of some of the climate risks is incorporated more systematically in interventions that are framed as early recovery or as humanitarian, because we still need some of that support, but we have to make a lot of that type of support, but we need to make sure that these interventions are aligned across different time frames. And second question, if I may, just to say that we are working with peace-building resources in some of these contexts, and Dr. Al-Mahdi, very interested and pleased to hear that you're inviting engagement early on, because we know that those types of funds are also very limited. They can help to catalyze action, climate action, particularly transboundary action. But to make those kinds of interventions sustainable, we need more resources. So I would be very happy to continue a discussion about how to link what we're doing now on a relatively small kind of dialogue frameworks into prospects for sustained funding for climate action. Thank you.
Would you like to take the first part and then Sandra?
Yep. All right. Thanks for the great question. So quickly on the second one, yes, definitely we'll be happy to have that conversation, and we actually do this with other institutions as well. Even for like the IDRC, for example, in Canada, for the Research for Development, we start to engage with them. Even we are not funding research as a Green Climate Fund, but we are engaging with them in their strategic plan to see like what type of research project they can really fund that can come to us for the scale as well. So we'll be happy to do the same with you as well. And quickly on the adaptation fragmentation aspect, so from GCF perspective, and to ensure really science is well taking care in terms of the project design. So for each project we have a very clear assessment criteria or investment criteria as we call it. The first one needs really to bring that climate rationale for the project. And that climate rationale, it's a science-based that represent the problem for the project and give the evidence for us the problem of the project actually being triggered by climate change, not by other factors. Or at least the climate change are the main contributor factor for that problem. We have another investment criteria where we look at the efficiency and effectiveness. And that really we look at all the interventions, all the solutions, has it been actually been well designed based on the best available science. So science need to be again coming very strong to confirm the interventions that actually proposed and the solution as well. Thank you.
You want me to headset? The first question about siloing, and so. Look, I think part of our, I'll go back to the point of, I think part of our problem is the division between humanitarian and development action and the different operational policies and procedures, the safeguarding policies that you would have and you would have in your, that are required in your investments that aren't mirrored in the way humanitarian financing works. I actually think that this is an area that deserves some investigation and some collaboration, that maybe through safeguarding, that could be an avenue for us to better integrate our operations and across sort of targeted areas for sector investment. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but it's just something that's really on my mind lately as we're talking about all of these things. I think understanding risk and having proper safeguarding procedures. Not that the humanitarian agencies have the capacity to do that or the mandate to do that. This is part of the question. How would they do that? How could they do that? But we as a community should find a way to collaborate better on that, in my view.
Yeah, maybe just the perspective of the multilateral development banks. We collectively have developed two processes, I would say. The first one is that we committed to aligning all of our operations with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So adaptation objectives, mitigation objectives, meaning that we would look at all of our operations and we would make sure that, you know, they follow. So whether it's a so-called climate project or not, because we do not have specific climate project. What we do is all of our development projects, we find the climate co-benefits in them, and we take the same approach. It could be, and then the second one, which is linked to my point, is we have developed climate finance tracking methodologies for adaptation, for mitigation. And then for adaptation, you can end up with 0% or 100% adaptation, depending on the objectives, depending on you know, what are the main objectives of the project and the context. So we really follow the science, like you say. We look at the context of vulnerability. We look at the opportunities for adaptation to address any issues that we have identified, and then we integrate those adaptation elements in the projects. Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly, just to reflect to your point related to the fragmentations and the impact of the interventions. I completely agree in some parts there is negative impacts of some interventions, and I will mention just one example from Yemen. Yemen is a water scarce country, and we rely to a large extent on the groundwater. We don't have surface water, we don't have rivers or lakes. And maybe 15 years back, the government supported the farmers by diesel subsidies, by providing the pumps and groundwater facilities in order to have food security. But within few years, we realized we are consuming the reserves of the groundwater. Nowadays, there is between 2 and 6 meters declining in the groundwater levels. And then they left the subsidies and they start new approach for water resources management. But nowadays with the conflict, there is something which we call the solar pumps. Before 2015, we don't have solar energy pumps in Yemen, even solar systems for domestic uses, which is good when we come to the domestic uses, which is good when we come to the use this solar energy for the hospitals, for the maybe water utilities which provide domestic water. But when we come for the irrigation, it is a problematic nowadays because it is spreading a lot. We made a study in the Sana Center in 2021. You can find it in our website. In Sana Basin alone, there are more than 35% of farmers starting using the solar pumps, and they rely completely on the solar pumps. And when we investigate, it's more than enough, even better than diesel pumps. And there is no control, there is no rules, there is no limits. And when we come to the support, when we come to discuss with the partners who are supporting farmers, they said they are supporting farmers with the limited capacities of these pumps. But when we come to the farmers themselves, we understand they are good enough to extend the systems and to large, even deep groundwater, which is now a very critical in Yemen and very important to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question. There's a question at the back.
Hi, Karolina Kalinowska here from the European Commission, the humanitarian side. Thank you so much for all your insightful interventions. I wanted to come back to the question of the private sector because you mentioned that indeed we need to increase their involvement. We see a decline in public financing, regrettably, especially compared to the needs. But how can we involve the private sector more in adaptation and resilience? What are your thoughts on that? Because we know that's a disproportionately low amount of private sector finance is going to adaptation as compared to mitigation. We know the reasons, but curious to hear your thoughts on what kind of interventions we could get them interested in. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think now more and more we have identified areas where adaptation interventions can be financed through the private sector. I would give the examples of drought resilient seeds. I would give the example of irrigation material that are looking at using the use of efficient water in some regions. So all of that in the water household and also agriculture sector, you could find interest in having the banking and microfinancing institutions supporting the private sector in commercializing these equipments in these areas. So I think there are some areas where the private sector can find a good market. Thanks.
Yeah, if I can comment on that also quickly. So to look at really how we mobilize the private sector to invest in adaptation project, of course, we need to understand why they are reluctant to invest in climate project, because mitigation comes with a very clear revenue streams. But if you look at is there an opportunity for them? Yes, and that requires us to do like a circular economy way of thinking. Because once you look at the value chain, whatever the sector you are tackling, water, agriculture, energy, or health, education, like we have the largest health project that's been approved as well in G7, bring the private sector, and that again by taking that the whole value chain within the health sector. We have another one for education sector. For water, I think the concept of treating water as an asset class that start to attract private sector. We have the largest water project being approved in South Africa, 1.5 billion, that actually bring the private sector by treating water as an asset class. We do also with the African Union, so join us on Monday 19 at 5:30 p.m. We'll again launch an African Union readiness program that again working with the private sector, identify the private sector, build the capacity of the private sector, and bring them to become an investor for the water sector. Because if you look at Africa, Africa needs 30 billion every year for the water sector, not in mitigation, but also in adaptation. So I think the whole value chain way of thinking and approach, that actually where we can define a proper or appropriate revenue streams, and those revenue streams need for us, from our perspective, need to align with Paris Agreement and also with the SDGs as well. So it's not a revenue stream where become like increasing water tariff, for example, that become again, it changed the whole idea of water as a public good. So we have to bring the private sector taking water as a public good and look at the appropriate revenue stream to maintain that level of affordability as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I could just ask my panel to do a tiny bit more work, even though they've committed so much to this session already. If you could just please just share with the audience, both here and online, your kind of, perhaps either your main takeaway from today's session or your hope for the future on this agenda.
Well, thank you so much. What I hope when next year come, when we are sitting in the same stage, we will discuss something implemented in the ground rather than discussing the climate finance challenges. And I don't know, this is up to, mainly it's up to us, but mainly up to climate finance. Thank you so much.
Thank you. But like, yeah, we have discussed something on the ground anyway with the Deputy Minister. Like, so we agreed like, yeah, on a first priority project in Yemen for early warning system, like 16 million. And we're looking forward to bring that quickly for our board for approval. But I think like the takeaway message it's, that I wanted to share with everyone, the Green Climate Fund, it's very committed to fragile and conflict states. And we currently have 500 million in our pipeline of projects in those states as well. And we really looking to taking this as a priority for us. We're also working with all fragile conflict states countries to really empower them to bring a direct access entity. Direct access entity in our terminology, it's a public entity or a private entity that it's national. And that's where we see really the opportunity to mobilize more climate finance for those countries. And that's our commitment I wanted to share with everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, I think my hope, but it connects to yours, is that next year we'll have some really good evidence to provide in the case of the Jahaz project in Jordan. But just to say, we're also doing work in Palestine and Lebanon and other places with this exact model. It's not refugee hosting communities, but other types of communities. We need to be able to start sharing these models out so that we can iterate them and figure out together how to scale them best. So in a year, my hope would be that we could step forward into that conversation.
Thank you. Well, earlier this year, we have launched a program called HOPE, Harvesting Opportunities for Poverty Eradication, and it will cover 10 to 15 low and middle income economies, including Yemen. And it will especially address what I was just referring to earlier, supporting smallholder farmers through microfinance, through access to market, through capacity building. So we really hope that by next year we will come back here with more results under that HOPE program. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I'd really like to thank my panel and all of the speakers today for coming to this event to discuss how do we enhance climate finance for recovery and resilience and adaptation in conflict-affected countries. I think the discussion's been very rich. I think a number of points for me as well is this issue of better understanding the trade-offs of some of the interventions. We cannot be embedding more risk. That's really important. Essentially, we need to be avoiding maladaptation. And I think you raised an interesting example from the Yemen where we're addressing a mitigation issue. So we're providing water, we're producing solar pumps, but actually you're also embedding another challenge there. Also, I think just to remind everybody, we talk a lot as well, we have on this session the humanitarian development peace nexus. These silos, we created these silos, which means it's our gift to break down some of those barriers. I mean, as Einstein said, we cannot change the world without changing our thinking. And I think we're starting to do that on some of these issues. And I'm really encouraged to see all of the work that's been done by all of the panelists who've spoken today. There really is, I think, things to be hopeful about, because the reality is we are working in some very challenging contexts, not just the countries we've been speaking about, but globally. And I think we've had a very robust and frank discussion today. So I thank you all very much. Thank you.